The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the small house on the edge of town. Rain lashed against the glass in heavy sheets, drowning out the quiet hum of the boy's breathing. He sat alone in his wheelchair, staring at the storm outside, his hands resting motionless on his lap. Another sleepless night. Another evening spent in silence, with only the distant flicker of the street lamp outside for company. He had grown used to it. The loneliness. The feeling of being trapped, not just in this house but in his own body. Then he heard it. A faint scratching at the door. At first, he thought it was the wind. Just another branch scraping against the porch. But then it came again. Persistent. Desperate. Scratch. 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 His fingers tightened on the armrest of his wheelchair. His heart pounded. It was late, too late for visitors. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But something deep inside told him he couldn't. Someone, or something, was out there. Summoning his courage, he wheeled himself toward the door. It was slow, frustratingly slow, but he managed. The scratching stopped as he reached the handle. A cold chill ran down his spine. Was whoever, or whatever, it was still there. He hesitated, then unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack. His breath caught in his throat. A dog. Not just any dog, a frail, shivering creature, soaked to the bone from the rain. Its fur was matted, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. It looked up at him with hollow, weary eyes, eyes that had seen too much pain, too much abandonment. The boy's chest tightened. It wasn't just the dog's condition that unsettled him. It was something else. Something off. The dog stood still, too still. It didn't bark. It didn't whimper. It just watched him. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, as if waiting for the other to make a move. Then the dog did something that made the boy's blood run cold. It tilted its head, ever so slightly, and then, it nodded. A chill spread through the boy's body. That wasn't normal. That wasn't natural. Something about this dog wasn't right. And yet, as strange as it was, the boy felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A connection. A whisper of understanding. Slowly, carefully, he reached out his hand. The dog didn't flinch. Didn't back away. It simply stepped forward, pressing its wet nose into his palm. And at that moment, deep in his chest, he felt it. A spark. A shift. Something changed. He didn't know it yet, but his life, the life he had resigned himself to, was about to take a turn no one could have ever predicted. And what happened next would leave everyone in tears. The boy sat in his wheelchair, staring at the dog curled up beside his feet. It had been hours since he let it in from the rain. Now, under the dim glow of the lamp, he could see it more clearly, every rib pressing against its thin skin, every scar hidden beneath its damp fur. Something about the dog unsettled him. Not in a fearful way, but in a way that made him question everything. It hadn't barked. It hadn't whimpered. And yet, when it looked at him, it felt as if it understood him better than anyone ever had. His fingers twitched slightly as he reached down, brushing against its head. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into his touch, closing its eyes as if it had been waiting for this moment. The boy let out a slow breath. "You're just like me, aren't you?" he whispered. The dog's ear twitched, but it didn't move. Alone. Abandoned. Left behind by the world. He knew that feeling well. A sharp knock at the door made the boy jump. His parents. They had been out for the evening, leaving him alone like they always did. He heard them talking outside, their voices muffled by the rain. "Did you hear that storm?" It was terrible, his mother's voice carried through the door. The boy's heart pounded. He wasn't supposed to let strays in. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Quickly, he wheeled himself around, motioning for the dog to move. It didn't. It just stayed there, watching him. "Go," he whispered urgently. The dog blinked. Then, to his shock, it quietly padded away, moving not to the door, but behind his wheelchair, into the shadows of the room, completely silent. Another knock. "Open up." Taking a deep breath, he reached for the door handle and pulled it open. His parents stepped inside, shaking off the rain. His father gave him a quick glance. "You all right, kid?" The boy nodded, his heart racing. "Yeah. Just, watching the storm." His mother sighed, hanging up her coat. "You should be in bed. It's late." He hesitated, then nodded. "I know." His father frowned. "Why does it smell like wet dog in here?" His stomach clenched. A low shuffle behind him. The boy's pulse spiked. His mother turned, her brow furrowing. "What was that?" The dog stepped forward, slowly emerging from the shadows. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, "Oh no," his mother groaned. "Tell me you didn't bring that thing in here." The boy swallowed hard. His father rubbed his forehead. "Son, we've talked about this. We can't take care of a dog." The boy clenched his fists. "But it has nowhere to go." His mother sighed. "That's not our problem." "It is to me," the boy shot back, surprising even himself. The dog remained still, watching the exchange with an eerie calm. His father folded his arms. "It's not safe. It could have diseases. You don't know where it came from." The boy gritted his teeth. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he knew it wouldn't change their minds. His mother shook her head. "It's just another stray. It's not special." The boy felt something inside him snap. "You don't know that." Silence. His father exhaled. "Look, we'll talk about this in the morning. But the dog stays outside." The boy opened his mouth to argue, but his mother was already ushering him toward his room. "Bed. Now." His hands tightened around the wheels of his chair, frustration boiling in his chest. The dog had understood him. Had listened. Had waited. How could they not see that? As he was wheeled away, he stole one last glance at the dog. It didn't move. Didn't fight. It just watched. But in those deep, unreadable eyes, the boy saw something else. A quiet promise. This wasn't over. Not yet. The house had gone quiet. His parents were asleep in their room, the storm outside had calmed, and only the steady ticking of the hallway clock filled the silence. But the boy couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The dog was still outside. Alone. A sharp pang of guilt twisted in his chest. It had trusted him, leaned into his touch like it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to care. And what had he done? Let it be cast out into the cold. His fists clenched. No. Not again. With slow, careful movements, he pulled himself into his wheelchair, careful not to make a sound. His fingers trembled as he rolled to the window, peering outside. His breath caught. The dog was still there, sitting at the edge of the yard. But it wasn't sleeping. It wasn't even resting. It was staring. At nothing. At everything. Its head was tilted upward, eyes locked onto the dark sky, completely still. A strange feeling crept over the boy's skin. What was it looking at? His fingers tightened on the windowsill. Then, as if sensing his gaze, the dog moved, but not in the way a normal dog should. It didn't stretch. It didn't shake off the cold. Instead, it shifted, its muscles barely tensed, and yet its body glided upright in one smooth, unnatural motion. A shiver ran down his spine. That wasn't normal. His throat felt dry as he reached for the window latch. He had to let it in. Had to see it up close again. The window creaked as it opened. The dog's head snapped toward him. His breath caught. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, without hesitation, the dog moved. Not toward the door. Toward the side of the house. His pulse spiked. What was it doing? He wheeled himself back quickly, straining to see, then, a sudden thump against the wall made him freeze. The dog had jumped. High. Too high. A second later, he saw it. A shadow rising outside his window, higher than any normal animal should be able to jump. His heart slammed against his ribs. No. That was impossible. Then, before he could react, a wet nose pressed against the open window, followed by two dark paws landing silently on the sill. The boy's blood ran cold. The dog had climbed up. Through the second-floor window. And it hadn't made a sound. The boy couldn't breathe. The dog's eyes locked onto his, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its tail didn't wag. It didn't pant. It just watched him. Then, slowly, it stepped inside. The air in the room felt heavier. The boy's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wanted to move. To back away. But something in his gut told him not to run. The dog's paws touched the wooden floor, its body eerily silent as it stood there, dripping from the rain. Then, something even stranger happened. The old radio on his nightstand crackled to life. A burst of static filled the room. The boy flinched. The radio wasn't even plugged in. The dog's ear twitched. The static shifted, not random noise anymore, but something else. Something almost like words. The boy's breath hitched. No. That was crazy. But then, help me. The boy's body stiffened. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his pulse hammering. Had he imagined that? The radio crackled again. Not safe, his skin prickled. He turned to the dog. It was still watching him. Still waiting. Then, before he could speak, before he could even process what was happening, the light in his room flickered out. Total darkness. And in the silence, in the black void of his room, the radio whispered again. This time, he heard it clearly. 2 words. Words that sent a chill down his spine. They're coming. The boy's breath hitched. The radio crackled once more, then fell silent. The only sound in the room was the pounding of his heart against his ribs. The dog hadn't moved. It just stood there, its eyes locked onto his, waiting. Waiting for what? The boy's fingers gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His body was frozen in place, fear curling around his chest like a tight fist. Then, a sound. Outside. A low hum, barely noticeable, vibrating through the night air. The dog's ears perked up. Its muscles tensed. The boy turned slowly toward the window. The sky was dark, empty. Nothing but the moon and the stars. But the hum was growing louder. A deep, unnatural vibration. Like something unseen was moving just beyond the tree line. His stomach twisted. Something was out there. The dog let out a low growl, stepping closer to him, placing itself between him and the window. The boy swallowed hard. He didn't understand what was happening. Didn't understand what he had just heard through the radio, why the lights had flickered, why this dog, this thing, was so different. But one thing was certain. It wasn't over. A new sound joined the hum. A rhythmic tapping, coming from downstairs. His skin went cold. His parents were asleep. No one else should be in the house. The dog's growl deepened. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate. Footsteps. Someone, or something, had entered the house. The boy's hands trembled as he reached for the wheelchair's wheels, turning himself slightly toward the door. His mind raced. Who could it be? A burglar? No. That didn't explain the hum outside. Didn't explain the radio. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. Something was very, very wrong. The dog suddenly moved, silently, fluidly, toward the bedroom door, standing like a soldier guarding its post. Then, a whisper. Faint. Just outside his door. He's here. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He clenched the wheels of his chair, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move, to do something. The dog's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, its body low, prepared to strike. The boy's mind raced. He needed to wake his parents. He needed to run. Then, the doorknob twisted. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. No. No, 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 the door swung open. The hallway light flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. For a moment, nothing was there. Just empty space. Then, a figure stepped forward. Tall. Thin. Dressed in black. A mask covered its face, but its eyes, deep, hollow pits, locked onto the boy. The dog lunged. A blur of motion. A snarl cut through the air. The figure stumbled back. Then, a second shadow appeared. And a third. The boy's blood turned to ice. There wasn't just one intruder. There were three. He had seconds to act. His wheelchair, his body, felt like a cage. He was trapped. Helpless. No. Not helpless. Not anymore. He reached out, his voice breaking. Go. The dog moved, faster than he had ever seen an animal move. A flash of fur. A blur of teeth. One of the figures let out a muffled grunt as the dog hit them like a bullet, knocking them back into the hallway. The boy spun his chair, his pulse hammering. He had to get out. Had to wake his parents. But before he could move, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Ice shot through his veins. His body locked up. The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes unreadable. Then, a voice. Low. Cold. You were never supposed to have it. The boy's stomach dropped. The grip on his shoulder tightened. The air felt heavier. Then, the lights went out completely. Total darkness. And in the blackness, the last thing he heard was the dog's snarl, a sound so deep, so fierce, that for the first time, the intruders sounded afraid. The darkness swallowed the room whole. The boy couldn't see. Couldn't move. The hand on his shoulder tightened, fingers digging into his skin like iron clamps. Panic surged through his chest. A low growl rumbled in the pitch black. Then, a snarl, a crash, a grunt of pain. The boy gasped as the grip on his shoulder suddenly released. There was a scuffle. The sound of footsteps staggering back. A thud. Then, silence. His heart pounded. He wanted to scream, to cry for help, but fear strangled his voice. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had come, the power flashed back on. Light flooded the room, revealing the chaos around him. The dog stood in a crouched stance, fur bristling, fangs bared. A few feet away, one of the masked intruders lay crumpled on the floor, groaning. The other two were still there. Standing. Watching. Not moving. The boy sucked in a sharp breath. Something about them wasn't right. They weren't attacking. They weren't even reacting. They just stood there, staring at the dog with eerie, unreadable faces. The one on the floor let out a sharp breath and muttered something under his breath. A single word. Abort. The other two figures tensed. Then, without hesitation, they turned and ran. Straight down the hallway. Straight for the front door. The boy's head spun. What just happened? His hands trembled on the armrests of his wheelchair. He turned his gaze toward the fallen intruder, the only one left. The man was struggling to get up, one arm cradling his ribs. The dog took a slow step forward, growling deep in its throat. The man coughed. Then, he vanished. Gone. Right before the boy's eyes. No sound. No flash. Just nothing. Like he had never been there at all. The boy's breath hitched. No. No, that wasn't possible. People didn't just disappear. The dog turned toward him, its eyes searching his face, as if waiting for him to understand. His chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths. He could barely think. Barely process what had just happened. His parents, his head snapped toward the hallway. His parents were still asleep. Had they heard none of this? He wheeled himself toward their door, heart pounding, and shoved it open. Mom. Dad. His voice came out too loud, too sharp. His parents stirred in bed, groggy and half awake. His mother frowned at him. What are you yelling about? The boy stared at them, his mind reeling. The lights had gone out. 3 intruders had broken into the house. There had been a fight in his room. And they had slept through all of it? He swallowed hard. Did you hear anything? His father rubbed his face with a sigh. Son, it's the middle of the night. Go back to bed. The boy's pulse pounded in his ears. They didn't know. They hadn't seen. They hadn't heard. They had no idea that something impossible had just happened in their own house. His hands trembled. What did that mean? The dog had been right. He wasn't safe here. His breath came fast and shallow as the realization crashed down on him. Whoever those men were, they had come for the dog. But they had also come for him. And they weren't finished. Not yet. The dog stepped closer to his wheelchair and nudged his hand. His fingers brushed against its fur, and in that instant, a strange sensation flooded through him. Not just fear. Not just panic. A thought. A message. We have to leave. The boy froze. That wasn't his thought. It had come from. His wide eyes locked onto the dog. And deep in his chest, he knew. The dog had spoken to him. Not with words. Not with sound. But in a way that no one else would understand. A voice in his head. A voice that wasn't his own. His throat went dry. This dog, this creature, was something more. Something far beyond what anyone believed it to be. And if they stayed here, if they waited, those men would come back. And next time, they wouldn't run. Next time, there would be no escape. His heart pounded as he turned toward the dog. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Where do we go? The dog didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, once again, the thought entered his mind, soft, steady, clear. I will show you. The boy's hands trembled as he sat in his wheelchair, his mind a storm of confusion and fear. The dog stood beside him, unmoving, its deep eyes locked onto his. The words, no, the thought, still echoed in his head. I will show you. His heart pounded. He should have been terrified. He should have questioned his own sanity. But somehow, he believed it. This dog, this strange, impossible creature, was not just a dog. And if they stayed here, they would never be safe. A sharp knock at the door made him flinch. His blood ran cold. Not again. The dog tensed, its ears flicking toward the sound. Its stance shifted, low, ready. The boy turned toward his parents' room, his breath shaky. They were still asleep. Still unaware. Another knock. Louder this time. His fingers gripped the wheels of his chair. A choice was forming before him. Stay. Risk everything. Or leave. A pit formed in his stomach. How? He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't run. As if sensing his thoughts, the dog nudged his hand. The boy turned to it, his breath shallow. Trust me, the voice whispered in his head. He swallowed hard. And then, before he could second-guess himself, he nodded. The dog moved fast, faster than any animal had the right to move. It darted to the window and pressed its nose against the latch. A soft click. The lock slid open on its own. His pulse pounded. That wasn't normal. A fresh wave of fear crashed over him, but there was no time to hesitate. He wheeled himself forward, gripping the frame. The night air rushed in, cold and crisp. The dog leapt onto the windowsill, then turned back. Waiting. The boy hesitated, panic creeping in. He couldn't jump out of a window, he was paralyzed. The knocking at the door turned to banging. The boy's heart stopped. No time. No thinking. Then, before he could react, the dog nudged his wheelchair. A sudden force lifted the chair off the ground. The boy gasped, his body freezing in shock as his entire wheelchair floated, through the air, through the window, and gently onto the grass outside. His hands gripped the armrests, his breath shaky. That wasn't normal. That wasn't possible. But it had just happened. The dog landed beside him, its eyes sharp, scanning the darkened street. Then, it looked at him again. Go. The boy sucked in a breath, turned the wheels of his chair, and followed. They slipped into the night, the wind cold against his skin. Behind them, the house stood still. Silent. But deep in his chest, he knew. This was just the beginning. They moved in silence. The boy didn't know where they were going. He didn't ask. He just followed. His mind spun with questions, but his gut told him not to speak. Not yet. Not until they were safe. Finally, after what felt like forever, they reached a clearing on the edge of town. Trees surrounded them, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and distant rain. The dog stopped. The boy exhaled, his hands shaking. What are we doing? The dog didn't answer. Not at first. Then, finally, you deserve to know the truth. The boy swallowed hard. Truth? The dog turned to him, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. And then, images flooded the boy's mind. Flashes. Memories. Not his memories. A cold metal room. A lab. Blinding white lights. People in long coats. Their voices sharp, urgent. A boy, himself, strapped to a table. His body limp. Needles piercing his skin. And beside him, a cage. A cage holding a small, trembling animal. The dog. His chest tightened. His breath came in short gasps. No. No, this couldn't be real. But the memories, they felt real. His voice cracked. What is this? The images shifted. Doctors whispering. Their words blurred, but their meaning clear. An experiment. Not just on the dog. On him. His hands clenched on the wheels of his chair. His stomach twisted. He wasn't born this way. He wasn't supposed to be paralyzed. Something had been done to him. His heart slammed against his ribs. And then, the final memory hit him like a freight train. One sentence. One chilling command from a voice he didn't recognize. Terminate the boy. Dispose of the dog. His breath hitched. That's why they had come. That's why the intruders had broken into his house. Not to take the dog. To take him. His hands trembled as he snapped back to reality, gasping. The dog was still staring at him, waiting. The truth crashed down on him. His whole life, his pain, his disability, was manufactured. Everything had been a lie. And now, the people who had created him, who had broken him, wanted him gone. The boy's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. And then, a new feeling took hold. Not fear. Not confusion. Anger. A fire ignited deep inside him, hotter than anything he had ever felt. They had taken everything from him. And now, they wanted to erase him. No. No, he wasn't going to let that happen. His grip on the wheelchair tightened. His pulse pounded. The dog met his gaze. Waiting. The boy exhaled, slow and steady. What do we do now? The dog's eyes gleamed. And in his mind, the answer was clear. We fight. The night air felt heavier now. As if the weight of the truth itself was pressing down on him. The boy clenched his fists. His whole life had been a lie. His paralysis. His isolation. His helplessness. They had taken it all from him. And now, they were coming to finish the job. But this time, he wasn't going to let them. The dog stood beside him, silent, waiting. For the first time, the boy didn't feel weak. He didn't feel trapped. He felt angry. And that anger burned like wildfire. His fingers twitched on the armrests of his wheelchair. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then, something strange happened. A warmth spread through his limbs. A slow, tingling sensation. His hands. His arms. His legs. The dog's eyes flickered toward him, as if sensing it. The boy's breath hitched. He could feel his legs. For the first time in years, he could feel them. His throat tightened. His heartbeat stuttered. No. That wasn't possible. But it was happening. His grip on the wheelchair tightened. Slowly, carefully, he moved his foot. And it responded. His stomach twisted in shock. His breath came in sharp gasps. No. No, this wasn't real. He tried again. His other leg shifted. Terror and hope tangled in his chest. This couldn't be happening. But it was. The dog stepped closer, pressing its forehead against his hand. The warmth intensified. Memories crashed over him again. The experiments. The whispers. The doctors. He's different. Shut it down before he realizes what he is. His pulse spiked. He wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to have this power. But they had tried to take it away. They had forced him into weakness. Now, something deep inside him was breaking free. And he wasn't afraid anymore. He grabbed the armrests of his chair, sucking in a breath. Then, he stood. His legs wobbled beneath him, weak, unsteady, years of being motionless taking their toll. But he was standing. His heart pounded as he took his first step. Then another. The dog watched him closely, unwavering. It had known all along. He turned to it, voice shaking. You did this?" The answer echoed in his mind. "No. You did." His chest tightened. His whole life, he had believed he was broken. Weak. Helpless. But that had been a lie. His legs weren't useless. His body wasn't useless. He had never been weak. They had just made him believe he was. A new emotion surged through him. Not just anger. Determination. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to hide. If they were coming for him, then he would be ready. A sound shattered the silence. A distant hum. His jaw clenched. They were coming. The dog growled low in its throat. The boy took a slow, steady breath. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the trees like an unseen force pressing against his skin. They were here. The boy clenched his fists, feeling the energy surge through his veins. His legs still trembled, weak from years of disuse, but he was standing. He was ready. The dog beside him remained still, its fur bristling, its gaze locked onto the darkened road ahead. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. A sleek black van tore down the street, its tires screeching as it came to a stop. The doors slammed open. Figures in black suits poured out, their movements sharp, efficient. They weren't just men. They were operatives. Trained. Precise. Dangerous. And they were coming for him. The boy exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. He wasn't afraid anymore. The dog stepped forward, standing between him and the approaching figures. A voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Stand down." The boy recognized that voice. He had heard it before. In his memories. In the lab. His stomach twisted. A man stepped into the light, tall, dressed in black, his face lined with cold calculation. The leader. The one who had ordered his termination. The boy's jaw clenched. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He simply studied him, his eyes flicking toward the dog. "You weren't supposed to wake up." The words sent a chill through the boy's spine. Wake up? What did that mean? The man took another step forward. "Come with us. You don't understand what you are." The boy's heart pounded. He didn't trust them. He never would. His hands curled into fists. "I understand enough." The man sighed, as if disappointed. "Then you leave us no choice." He lifted a hand. The operatives moved. They rushed forward in perfect synchronization, their weapons raised, their footsteps silent. The dog leapt. A blur of fur and teeth, moving faster than the human eye could track. The first man went down with a grunt, his weapon ripped from his hands before he even realized what had happened. The others hesitated, just for a second. And that was enough. The boy felt the power surge through him again, hot and electric, racing through every limb. He moved. No wheelchair. No hesitation. His legs obeyed him now. He stepped forward, lifting his hand without thinking, and the nearest operative flew backward as if struck by an invisible force. The others stumbled, their precision faltering. They hadn't expected this. They had thought he was weak. They had made him weak. But now, he was something else entirely. The dog struck again, weaving between attackers with unnatural speed. The boy followed, his body lighter, stronger than it had ever been. The training they had forced into him, the experiments, the control, they had tried to suppress it. But now, it was his. He had control. Not them. A shockwave of energy burst from his body, sending the last of the operatives crashing to the ground. Silence. Heavy, deafening silence. The boy stood in the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands tingling with power. The leader, the man who had given the order, was still standing. Watching. Not afraid. Just studying him. Then, in the quiet, the man smiled. Not in defeat. In understanding. Like this was what he had expected all along. "You've finally woken up," he murmured. "Good." The boy's pulse pounded. What did that mean? The man took a step back, his gaze flicking toward the van. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." Then, the headlights flared blindingly bright, forcing the boy to shield his eyes. By the time he looked again, the van was gone. The operatives. The leader. Vanished. He exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. His legs burned, weak and unfamiliar beneath him. But he was still standing. He turned to the dog. It was watching him, silent, waiting. The boy swallowed hard. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night was quiet again. The van was gone. The operatives had vanished. But the boy knew, this wasn't the end. His legs trembled beneath him, the weight of his own body unfamiliar after so many years in a wheelchair. He was exhausted, his muscles burning, his breath ragged. But he was standing. And he wasn't the same boy they had tried to control. He turned to the dog. It sat calmly beside him, its glowing eyes watching him as if waiting for his next move. His hands trembled at his sides. His mind was still spinning. He had spent years believing he was helpless. That his body had betrayed him. That his life had been decided for him. But the truth had been stolen from him. He had never been broken. They had made him weak on purpose. And now he was free. The dog stepped forward, pressing its head against his palm. The warmth from its touch spread through his body, steadying him, grounding him. A thought whispered in his mind. What now? He swallowed hard. What now? Could he go home? Pretend everything was normal? No. They would come back. And he couldn't let that happen. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The world felt bigger now, more uncertain. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He had a choice. He could run. Disappear. Or he could fight. Not for revenge. Not for anger. But for everyone else like him. For the ones who had been told they were less. For the ones who had been lied to. For the ones who still didn't know the truth. He clenched his fists. He wouldn't let them do this to anyone else. Not ever again. The dog let out a soft huff, almost as if it understood. Then, for the first time, its tail wagged. A small, simple motion. But it meant everything. The boy took a slow, deep breath. He wasn't alone. He had a purpose now. And together, they were going to change everything. He gave the dog a small smile. Let's go. The dog's ears perked up. Then, side by side, they stepped into the unknown. Not as experiments. Not as victims. But as survivors. And no one would ever take their freedom away again.